Welcome to GRE Snacks, snackable episodes about the GRE exam and graduate school admissions. I'm Tyler, the founder of Achievable, and we have an affordable GRE course that includes everything you need to ace your GRE exam. A full textbook, videos on key topics, tons of GRE questions backed by our memory-enhancing algorithm, a built-in study planner, a machine learning essay grader for your essays, and full-length practice exams. You can try it out for free by visiting achievable.me, and if you like it, the code podcast gets you 10% off at checkout. Now, let's get started. Today, we've got Brian Prestia from Reason Test Prep, on the line with us today, and really happy to have you back, Brian. Could you introduce yourself for people who haven't heard your earlier episodes?
Sure. Thanks, Tyler. Thanks for having me back. So yeah, I'm the owner of Reason Test Prep. We do online tutoring for the SAT, ACT, GMAT, and GRE with a focus on the graduate exams. Most of our stuff nowadays is GMAT and GRE.
Very cool. Yeah, so then today we're going to be talking about the GRE Reading Comprehension it's the verbal section, but reading comprehension is a very large chunk of it. So yeah, if we're talking about reading comprehension questions, and there's like subcategories and just kind of how to break each of these questions down and solve them.
Yeah.
So take it away. What are the main categories within reading comprehension?
Yeah, well, I guess maybe first just going back to our previous episode about the argument questions. So again, like point of confusion is you got reading comp, which is what ETS calls everything that's sort of reading comp-ish, but then you've got the argument questions, and then you've got this sort of traditional reading comp. So yeah, so obviously.
Yeah, so what's the distinction between those two?
Yeah, so just as a reminder, the argument questions are, going to be typically an argument, except in the case of like an inference question where it's really body of evidence and kind of like you're making the argument. But basically, the way to distinguish, just to repeat from earlier episode, is the argument questions typically have one question only, and reading comp questions typically have multiple questions, usually 2 or 3 or on the shorter version of the GRE is probably not going to be more than 3, but occasionally you could have had 4 on a really long passage. And it's just like a totally different skill set, right? Like argument questions is really like logic and like reading very, very critically. And a traditional reading comp is more like the kind of stuff that was on the SAT and ACT, and that's more typical of like what you do in graduate school, where you're just like reading something and trying to understand the author's, purpose and digest the information.
Great. Yeah. So then let's take it away, I guess.
Yeah. So question types. All right. So I wish ETS would just make this easier and just call them argument questions and reading comp. Then then people wouldn't get confused. Really, like I said, it's unfortunate that people don't even understand that there's a difference. But so on traditional reading comp, you have I would characterize it as 2 broad categories of questions. One I would call explicit question types. So questions that ask about things that are explicitly stated in the passage. And then you have implicit question types. So, things that ask about, what the passage implies. And within, obviously there's like specific question types within those 2 buckets, but I think that's a good way to get started thinking about it. And I would also say, I think much more of what you see is implicit and asking you to, understand what's implied rather than being able to characterize like what was explicitly stated.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. So maybe I would probably start with before we get into the the weeds on each of these each of the question types, let me just preface and say there's obviously a whole separate strategy around how to read the passages, and obviously that's not really what we're focusing on today, but I'll just quickly mention, because I think it's really, really important to how you answer the questions, is the explicit questions are asking more about what the author says, right? So it's really testing like your literal comprehension of, what you're reading. And the implicit question types are really asking more about, like what's implied, right? And so for those, it's really much more important to understand what I call like the why of the passage, right? So why is the author saying this? What's the point of this? What's the author's purpose in writing this passage or in using this in this word or writing this sentence? So I'd say the explicit question types really align more with like your literal comprehension and your understanding of what the passage is saying. And the implicit question types really align more with your understanding of the author's intention and why the author is saying what he or she is saying. So that's the first thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. And then on the specific question types. So for the explicit question types, people might disagree with me here, but really there's only one question type that I would like flatly put in the explicit bucket, and that is like a detail question. So it helps to, first of all, be able to identify these questions, right? Because like, you know, it doesn't matter if you understand how to approach a detail question if you don't even know that it is a detail question.
Right.
So that's step one, is identifying each of these. So in the case of a detail question, the wording, you know, either the question will clearly indicate that what they're asking about is something that is directly stated. So it'll say something like, you know, the author states, or the author mentions, or the passage states which of the following, right? So something that it makes it clear that they're asking about what's explicitly stated. But the other, there's another like kind of code word for detail question that I think a lot of people just don't pick up on, and that is according to the passage. When you see according to the passage, you know, what is true of, you know, harbor seals or something like that. You know, that you could read that according to the passage is basically a detail, like trigger for a detail question. And then, yeah, then once you know it's a detail question, then strategy is pretty simple. I mean, go back to the passage, find the relevant details, and then look for an answer that's essentially like a paraphrase of that, right? So like the right answer is not going to exactly say what the passage said. That would be too easy. So you're looking for something that basically, you know, says the same thing, but in different words. So that's how they're testing your literal comprehension, is essentially, can you rephrase what was said there in an accurate way? That's what the right answer is. And then the wrong answers are going to either just be like totally off, right? They're like not even mentioned in the passage, or the harder ones will be things like, you know, details that are mentioned in the passage, right? But that like aren't the right detail. You know, it's kind of like the wrong part of the passage, or it's the right detail, but they're distorting that detail in a way that makes it wrong. So it's like, you know, the wrong answer is built off of that correct detail, but they tweak one or two words in, you know, in the wording of the answer choice to make it just flatly wrong.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Cool. Okay. Should we pivot to the implicit question types?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So implicit question types. There are a few. There are a handful of these. So the two I would start with, because they're very related, are and again, anyone who's like studied for the GRE or done practice tests, whatever, is going to recognize all this stuff. So one is the like overall, like big picture question. And that will be, you know, what is the author's primary purpose? What is the main purpose of the passage? Sometimes they'll ask for a title, like what would be, you know, an appropriate title for this passage. Those are all, even if it's asking for the title, what they're really asking is, what is the author's main purpose, right? So that's something you should really be picking up on when you read the passage in the first place, I would say.
Right.
And then the other very similar question is what's known as a function question. And so that you could think of as just like a more specific version of a, you know, kind of big picture purpose question, where they'll say, you know, what is the function of this sentence? Or on the GRE, sometimes they'll even say, which sentence performs this function? So it's like almost like a backwards, it's like a reverse function question, where they give you the function and then you have to go and find the sentence that performs that function.
Interesting. Yeah, that sounds hard.
Those are hard. Yeah. So anyway, I think like strategy for these questions, number one, again, you've got to understand what the author's intention is, both on like a big picture level and on like, okay, what is the point of this paragraph? What is the author trying to do in this paragraph? If you're answering more like what the sentence says, or what the paragraph or what the passage is talking about, rather than why the author wrote it, well, then you're probably getting the question wrong. So that's one thing. The second thing is you have to really pay attention to like tone and attitude, right? So if the author is being very argumentative, right? well, then an answer like, the author's purpose was to criticize or something like that, like might be right. Whereas if the author's tone is like very neutral, well then no, it's going to, the right answer is going to have to be more like explain or describe or something like that. So part of it is just like picking up on the like purpose and tone. And then a couple other like strategies I think that go into this, but one other pattern I think you see in the right answers is they're often worded in a deliberately vague way. For whatever reason, like they use very vague language, and then the wrong answers will be more specific. And that's just like tempts people. I don't know what like itch that scratches, but it definitely scratches.
Well, I think there's a lot of standardized tests where the most direct answer is the right answer, right? The ACT and SAT is a good example of that. So it's like now we're screwing with people a little bit.
Yeah. So like, for example, but remember, these are questions asking about broadly like the author's intention or the author's purpose in doing something, right? Like word choice or a sentence or a paragraph. So for example, the right answer might say something like, the author's purpose was to criticize a recent theory, right? And the wrong answer might say something like, the author's purpose was to, take issue with, and then, get into some take issue with recent study about, the position of Mars relative to Venus or something like that. And like people will be kind of tempted by like that specificity, but then like that's actually not really what the point of it. It wasn't about that exactly. And so like that answer is just wrong, but people are tempted by like the specificness of it. So
got it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that is a tricky. It's important to remember if you're coming from, taking the SAT or ACT as your last standardized test, which is most people, the GRE has very different goals. Their goal is to really like, I don't know, maybe the nice way of putting it is make you think.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, I think this goes back to maybe one of the earlier episodes that we had about the, this idea of no ambiguity, but I think we talked about like, suboptimal answers, and I think in the last episode as well, where, they have to make the questions hard, right? And so in order to do that, you have to have, wrong answers that are tempting. Not all of them necessarily, but at least one that's like really tempting. And then you also need to have the right answer not be perfect, right? Because even if the best wrong answer is really, really good, right? If the right answer is perfect, then people are still going to pick that right answer. So they have all these ways of like disguising the right answer. It sounds like maniacal and, just mean or whatever, but it's just
right. Like they've got like a little top hat and like they're twisting their mustaches as they write this.
Totally. But yeah, like, I mean, it's just how do you create a test where you can separate people who are at the top end of the spectrum, right? Like you need questions that are really hard where only people who are at a 168 level and above on the GRE will get it right, whereas someone who's at a 165 level will get it wrong, right? You need questions that can really parse people like kind of at that level or delineate at that level. So yeah, anyway, you do things like make the right answer suboptimal, and on these like, purpose questions and function questions, often what they do is they just make the right answer very vague. It's still right, like it's still capturing the author's intention correctly. It's just very vague, and then they'll hit you with a wrong answer that is just so tempting because it's more specific and it feels like it's really getting into like the details that the passage is getting into, but then it's just wrong because it's like not actually capturing the author's purpose correctly. So anyway,
right, yeah. And any tips in general for sort of deciphering the author's purpose?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So this obviously gets more at how you're reading the passage, but
oh right, yeah.
So ideally, you've done this when you read the passage. You know what I mean? Like, of course, if you have to go back and reread, you have to go back. But ideally, this is what I'm about to say is true of the way you read it in the first place. So I think there's a couple things here. One is this is easier said than done, but you have to get yourself out of the like passive seat at the table where you're just like a sponge, just absorbing the passage, and really go kind of on the attack and be like, I need to read it not from the point of view of the reader, which is who you are, right? So that's hard to like not be the reader since you are the reader. You have to kind of get up and like come to the other side of the table effectively and view it from the point of view of the person writing it. So I actually just, I have all the different ways of like, I have like a visual that I sometimes like draw for people, but I actually just recently gave this like analogy that might be helpful here. And I'll throw it at you, Tyler. You can tell me what you think. Feel free to shoot this down. But basically, it's like when you go to the movies, right? Or when you watch a movie, you're obviously in the seat of the viewer and you're passively just absorbing the movie, right? Like you're not doing any work. You're just sitting there kind of enjoying the movie, right? But it would be as if your goal was to not do that, but to actually try to think about it from the point of view of the screenwriter and be like, okay, if, which ruins the movie, obviously, when you're, if you're watching Harry Potter and like in the beginning of the movie, some like new professor, like it gets introduced, you're like, okay, obviously something's going to happen with this new professor, right? Because like, that's why they introduced this character. He's either going to be bad or good. And like, you can start to pick.
Right. He's going to be involved.
Right. Right. And you might even go deeper if you're really thinking about from the point of view of the writer. Right. That like, okay, what is J.K. Rowling trying to do here? Why did she characterize this, this character in this particular way, or why they describe, why is the character doing this or whatever? Again, it ruins the whole experience of watching the movie. But like, that's how you need to attack a reading comp passage, is think about it from the point of view of the person writing it and what are they trying to do at every turn. So,
yeah.
Yeah,
I think it's helpful, especially to think about it once you're armed with sort of what these question types are, because then you can look at it. You can look at, say, the question even before you read the passage and go, "Oh, this is a strengthened question" or whatever.
Right.
And then you can read the passage with that context.
Yeah. I think when you see that the first question on a reading comp passage is like a primary purpose, like what's the author's primary purpose? Well, like obviously you've got to read it with that lens, but honestly, I'd read it with that lens anyway, because it's really helpful for answering some of the other question types. And maybe actually that's a good pivot back to the question types, because that kind of leads into like what I would suggest strategically on like inference questions, for example. So I don't know if you want, maybe I can elaborate on that.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So, and by the way, I don't think I gave you like one answer to the question of how to read for, what the author's purpose is. There's a bunch of other more specific things, but I think like just before we close the door on that one change of mentality of like turning the switch on where you go into an active reading mode, without that, nothing's going to happen. So I'd say that's like the starting point really. And I definitely, we see people who like just literally need that. Like they understand how to read actively and critically, but they're just not doing it. They don't realize that that's really how they need to kind of read it. So anyway, that's one starting point for it all. But okay, so for the other implicit question types, let's talk about inference questions. So for inference questions, really you have two, I would really think of these in kind of two types. One is general inference questions and the other is specific inference questions. General inference questions like don't give you really like any anchor in the passage to like go back and like look for the answer. So they'll be worded, which of the following would the author most likely agree with? Right? Like,
right.
Okay. Like,
and it's like the sky is blue. It's like, okay, great.
Yeah, exactly. Like you can't anticipate what the answer is going to be. And it's a very general question, right? And it's an inference because they're asking you to infer what the author would agree with. So, in a case like that, it again really relies on your big picture understanding. Like you got to understand the author's tone and purpose and, sort of attitude. That is really the key on those questions. And then, you go to the answers and, you may have to, based on the answers, you may have to go back and like research the answer in the passage. So you might be like, okay, like A, B, and C are totally inconsistent with the author's point here, but D and E are both close. I don't know. And then you got to go back and be like, all right, let me see what he says about or what she says about, this answer choice and this answer choice. And the other thing that we talked about, I think in the, previous episode that we did is, here's a case where you don't want a really bold extreme answer because you're drawing an inference, and the further you leap from what was stated, the less likely you're standing on an inference that can definitely be drawn. So you're really looking for something that makes a very small leap from what was stated. And then the specific inference questions are very similar in that regard. The difference is just like it'll say something more specific in the question, like, what can be inferred about the author's mention of Mars or something like that, right? So in that case, you're probably best off going back to the passage, rereading what the author said about Mars. But again, remembering that you're being asked to draw an inference. So the answer might not be a paraphrase the way it is on a detailed question. It might make you, make a little bit of a leap, or even in very hard questions, maybe draw information from kind of like two parts of the passage and like combine them to draw some inference. Those are the hardest ones where like you're actually pulling multiple pieces of information to kind of draw some conclusion based on it. But still,
Right.
You want like the smallest leap that could be made. And the more you're going off on your own and drawing conclusions that are, not totally warranted, the less likely it is that, you're going to be on the right answer.
Yeah. It makes a ton of sense.
Cool. Okay. And then the last question type, quickly, if this is almost not even worth mentioning because I feel like these questions are pretty straightforward, but it's probably just, good to cover it all. Vocab and context questions, right? So you get these questions that ask, they're reading comp questions, right? They're part of a reading comp passage, but they're asking you about the meaning of a word in the context of the passage. I think to the untrained eye, you might just call that an explicit question type because it's like, well, aren't they just asking you like about what the word means? Like, you're not really drawing an inference, but that's not really the case because they're vocabulary in context, right? So the game on those questions is, can you discern the meaning of a word based on the context, right? So you are, kind of drawing an inference a little bit because you really have to think about how the word is being used in that sentence, and and what you can infer about its meaning based on that. And I think here, a common wrong answer will be like the obvious definition of a word, when the right answer is going to be like maybe more of like a secondary definition or something that's more based on the context and not like the obvious definition of the word.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense too. And then what is next up on our list here?
Yeah, so that's it for the reading comp question types. The other thing that maybe to quickly talk about if you want is the like wrong answer, some of the more broad like wrong answer patterns. So obviously we talked a little bit in the context of the individual question types, right? Like what some of the vague answers are right, those are more often right, and maybe a more specific answer can often be wrong on a like general, quite like a big picture purpose question. But I think you could even identify some like broad trends over all the questions that may be worth quickly talking about.
Sure. I think that's good. And that'll be a good way to kind of wrap this up.
Cool. Okay. So I guess the first thing I would say is this again goes back to like my belief that getting the author's purpose and tone is the most important thing, even when you're not being asked about it. Okay. So I think that wrong answers are often wrong simply because maybe this isn't the right way to say it. Maybe they're wrong for other reasons, but you can identify them as wrong simply because they're just totally inconsistent with the point of the passage and the author's purpose, right? So like even and I can just tell you as someone like, I very rarely miss reading comp questions, and I can often be very fast. I'm not a very fast reader, actually. Like I'm a pretty slow reader, I think. But I can be very, very fast with the questions themselves. And part of it, and I've noticed this when I've personally tutored people, is I can see that other people are not leveraging this, and I am. And so it's like an obvious discrepancy. But basically, even on like a detail question, I might read, let's say the right answer is E, okay? And I read A, B, C, and D. And as I read them, I'm like, okay, I don't remember this in the passage, okay? But that doesn't mean that it's wrong, because maybe it was in the passage and I can't remember this, right? But what I can say is, I don't see why this would be in the passage, because it's not matching what the point of the passage is, right? So you can often eliminate answers even on detail questions by understanding the author's overall, purpose and the tone and kind of what the point of everything was, because you can just be like, look, like, yeah, I don't actually remember, reading this or not reading it, but I just don't see how this would be in the passage because, yeah, it's just not consistent with where the author was going. So that's the first thing, is that wrong answers are often wrong, partly because they're just like not really related to the central focus of the passage or the author's purpose. And understanding that purpose and tone can allow you to be like really, really fast in eliminating answers.
Interesting. Okay. And it's not like a shortcut, but it's more of an extension of what you already should be learning. It's like the next level of inferring what the author means or wants.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think it's a shortcut. Yeah. I don't think it's a shortcut at all. I think it's just like really, I don't know what to call it, but I suppose it's just like real ability at picking up on what the point of the passage is and recognizing that an answer that isn't in line with that just can't be right? Because like, how can it be the right answer is not even, in line with the point of the passage. So, and like, I don't want to exaggerate, but you can sometimes go through 3 questions in 40 seconds. You know what I mean? Like something lightning fast if you're really pinched on time, and just be like, okay, no. I think it's this, just based on, my overall understanding of the passage. So anyway, that's one thing. And then a second thing is, like we talked about, very, very common that a right answer is suboptimal, but not wrong, right? So you have to really know that when you're looking for the right answer, you can't be looking for the perfect like instantiation of like what what it should say. You have to be open to just something being acceptable and deliberately written to be not sounding that great. And
right.
You couple that with an understanding of what often happens with the wrong answers, which is specifically on the like traditional reading comp. What you often get is an answer that's like 95% perfect, right? And then like has 1 word or 2 words that are just wrong, So like on a general level, it might sound better than the right answer because like 95% of it is like exactly what you wanted, you know what I mean? And the wrong answer, or sorry, the right answer, like everything about it sucks basically, but it's not wrong. It's just suboptimal and just not really it doesn't sound that good. So you really,
but it's not wrong.
It's not wrong. And the wrong answer will sound better to your ear at first, but then there's a word that you could be like, okay, yeah, but like that word right there, that's just definitely wrong. There's no way this answer could be right with that word in it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great tip. And I think just like a good way to approach the GRE verbal in general.
Yeah.
But especially these reading comp questions.
Yeah. I think, in the previous episode, we were talking about like the importance of precision, and like there, I think I was talking a little bit more about like the arguments and like being really precise in the way that you break down the argument. On reading comp, you don't need a lot of precision on the passage, right? There's only, especially on a long passage, just like only so much that you could possibly remember anyway. So you're really there, you're actually not trying to read it very, very precisely and really trying to just get a good understanding of the author's intention and kind of the function of the parts of the passage. But at the answer choices, you have to be really, really precise because, again, a wrong answer might sound better than the right answer, but then there's just like 1 word that just like torpedoes the whole answer. And if you're not being really careful in the way that you read it, then you're going to completely miss that and you get the question wrong.
Right. Yeah, makes a ton of sense. Anything else on this topic before we wrap up?
No, I mean, I guess just the fact that the reading of the passage is the other half of the story. So obviously we're focusing more on the questions themselves and identifying them and answering them. A lot of this obviously starts with how well you read the passage, but I think people neglect the question types, and they don't have any idea that there's, I guess they know there's different question types, but they're not familiar with them. They're not familiar with what they're expected to do on those question types. So, if you're looking to bring your score up, a few points on the verbal section, even setting aside how well you read the passage, like there's definitely, juice to be squeezed, from the lemon on just purely getting better at the identifying the question types and knowing how to answer them.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much. This has been GRE Snacks, hosted by Tyler from Achievable with Brian Prestia from Reason Test Prep. And Achievable has a great online GRE course that you can try for free by going to achievable.me and use the code podcast to get 10% off at checkout.